2 hours ago, I sat in my driveway and sobbed until I couldn't breathe, clutching a cracked digital recorder that a hospice nurse slipped into my hand at the funeral. For 3 months, my parents told me that Grandpa refused to see me, that he'd called me ungrateful with his last breath. I believed them. I lived with that guilt eating my soul. But then I pressed play, and I heard his shaky, beautiful voice say, "Sweetheart, I know they aren't letting you in, but I'm waiting for you." My parents didn't just keep me from his bedside, they lied to a dying man to cut me out of his life. I'm finally ready to tell you what else was on that tape. I sat in the dark of my driveway for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. In my hand was the small digital recorder Elena, the night nurse, had pressed into my palm as I left the cemetery. She didn't say a word, just gave me a look that said everything. My parents were already inside the house, probably pouring wine and discussing the estate, convinced they'd successfully managed me out of Grandpa's final months. For 90 days, they told me he was too tired for visitors. They said he was angry that I hadn't moved back home to help. I'd spent every night crying, wondering how the man who taught me to fish could turn so cold at the end. I finally hit the play button with a shaking thumb. The static cleared, and then I heard it. The heavy, rhythmic hiss of a hospital oxygen machine, and then Grandpa's voice. It was thin, but unmistakable. "Sarah, honey," he whispered. "I know you aren't here because they aren't letting you in. I've seen the way your mother hides her phone when it rings." My heart stopped. He didn't hate me. He was waiting for me. I sat there in the silence of my car, realizing the people who raised me had spent months lying to a dying man just to keep us apart. I remember the sterile, suffocating smell of that hospital lobby. I can still see my mother standing there, smoothing her skirt as if she were at a garden party instead of the ICU. When I tried to push past her, she didn't raise her voice. She just put a hand on my arm and said, "He doesn't want to see you, Sarah. He needs peace, and you only bring drama." It was so calm, so practiced, that for a second, I actually doubted myself. Then my father stepped forward. He didn't look me in the eye. He just looked at the security guard near the elevators and told me, "If you don't respect his wishes and leave right now, I'll have you escorted out. Don't make this harder than it already is." I spent the next week calling the nurse's station every 2 hours from my kitchen table. Each time, a different voice told me the same thing: "I'm sorry, the primary family has restricted all information. We can't tell you his condition." I was his only granddaughter. We used to speak every Sunday. Now, I was a stranger in a waiting room, blocked by a wall of medical privacy laws and my own parents' coldness. I couldn't understand why they were so desperate to keep me in the dark. The following Sunday, my parents hosted a family dinner under the guise of supporting each other. I walked in hoping for an olive branch, but the atmosphere was already poisoned. My aunts and cousins wouldn't even meet my eyes while passing the mashed potatoes. Finally, my mother cleared her throat, looking around the table with a theatrical sigh of pity. "It's just such a shame," she told everyone. Sarah was always too busy with her own life to make time for Grandpa's final days. He kept asking for her, and she just never showed up. I felt the blood rush to my face. I dropped my fork, the metal clattering against the china like a gunshot. "That is a lie," I said, my voice trembling. "You blocked me at the hospital. You told security to keep me out." My father didn't even look up from his plate. He just shook his head and whispered, "Don't lie in this house, Sarah. It's embarrassing." The table went silent, filled with the judgmental stares of people who had known me since I was a baby. I realized then that they weren't just keeping me from Grandpa, They were burying my reputation so that when the end came, no one would question why I was left with nothing. In the middle of that nightmare, there was one person who didn't look at me like I was a monster. Her name tag said Elena. It was during my third attempt to sneak into the ICU, just as my mother caught me and started her usual lecture about respecting boundaries. Elena was coming off her shift, pulling off her blue latex gloves. As she passed me in the narrow hallway, she didn't keep her head down like the others. She looked me straight in the eyes with a look so heavy with pity it made my stomach turn. She slowed her pace, her hand reaching into the pocket of her scrubs. I saw the corner of a folded piece of paper between her fingers. She was leaning toward me, her voice a mere breath, when my mother's hand snapped onto my shoulder. "We're leaving, Sarah," she snapped. Elena instantly pulled back, her face smoothing into a mask of professional indifference. I watched her walk away, realizing in that moment that she wasn't just a witness to his vitals, she was a witness to the psychological war happening behind those closed doors. She had seen my parents whispering in Grandpa's ear while he was too weak to fight back. She knew the truth, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. I just didn't know yet what she had seen when the rest of the world wasn't looking. Back in the solitude of my car, I finally let the recording play through. The sound of the hospital was constant, the rhythmic wheeze of the ventilator and the distant beep of monitors, but Grandpa's voice was the only thing that mattered. As I listened, the grief turned into a cold, hard knot of rage. He spoke slowly, pausing for breath, as he recounted the stories my parents had fed him every single day. They told him I had taken a portion of my early inheritance and hopped on a plane to Europe. They described me laughing at cafes in Paris and sunbathing in Italy while he lay there dying. My mother actually told him I said I didn't want my last memory of him to be depressing. Then, the audio shifted. I heard the door click shut on the tape, and Grandpa's voice dropped to a jagged whisper. "I know they're lying, Sarah," he panted. "I know my girl. They're looking for the papers, but they won't find them." He let out a wet, rattling cough that broke my heart. "I hid the key in the garden. Under the stone with the carved bird, where we used to feed the robins. Find it. Don't let them take what's yours." The recording ended with a soft click. My parents hadn't just stolen our final moments, they had tried to erase my character to justify their greed. But Grandpa had outsmarted them. He left me a map, and I knew exactly which stone he meant. I drove to Grandpa's house at 2 a.m, keeping my headlights off as I pulled into the lane. The old Victorian looked like a ghost in the moonlight, now fitted with the sleek, blinking security cameras my father had installed the day after the funeral. I stayed low, creeping along the shadows of the porch until I reached the overgrown flower bed near the steps. The ground was half frozen, the dirt biting into my fingernails as I clawed at the spot beneath the stone with the carved robin. My breath hitched with every snap of a twig, terrified a neighbor would call my parents. My fingers finally hit something hard and cold. I pulled a small, rusted metal box from the earth, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't find stacks of cash or jewelry inside. Instead, there was a heavy brass key and a thick envelope protected by a plastic bag. I opened it under the glow of my flashlight. It was a will, dated only a year ago, with Grandpa's bold, steady signature on every page. This wasn't the document the lawyer had mentioned. If this was the real will, then whatever my parents were planning to read tomorrow was a lie. The sun was barely up when I pulled into the driveway of Mr. Henderson, a retired estate attorney and an old friend of my grandfather's. He sat across from me in his quiet kitchen, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of his spoon against a ceramic mug. He listened to the recording twice, his face hardening with every word of Grandpa's shaky whisper. Then, he put on his reading glasses and spread the garden will out on the table next to the document my parents had filed with the county. "The one your parents have was signed 4 days before he passed," Mr. Henderson said, his voice low and heavy. "Look at the signature, Sarah. It's a shaky scrawl. According to the medical logs the nurse gave you, he was on heavy doses of morphine that day. He didn't have the capacity to sign a legal document, let alone understand one. He tapped the older will I'd found in the dirt. This one here? This is ironclad. It was signed while he was of sound mind, witnessed and notarized. What your parents did isn't just a lie, it's felony fraud." He pushed his cold coffee aside and looked at me with eyes full of a terrible kind of sympathy. "If you bring this forward, Sarah, there's no going back. The authorities will get involved. We're talking about a criminal investigation. You could be sending your own mother and father to prison." I stared at the documents, the ink blurring as my eyes filled with tears. I thought of my mother's cold hand on my arm at the hospital and my father's threat to call the police on me. They hadn't hesitated to destroy my relationship with Grandpa for a house and a bank account. Now, I held their lives in my hands. I had to decide if I was willing to be the one to finally break this family apart. The atmosphere in my parents' living room was suffocating. They sat on the sofa like grieving royalty, dabbing their eyes with linen handkerchiefs while the rest of the family looked on in somber silence. It was a masterclass in performance. My father kept touching the deed to Grandpa's estate on the coffee table, his fingers lingering on the paper as if he were already mentally measuring for new carpet. Just before the lawyer arrived to start the formal reading, my mother caught my eye and gestured toward the kitchen. When we were alone, she didn't offer a hug or a kind word about Grandpa. Instead, she leaned in close, her voice a sharp, cold whisper. "Sarah, we know you've been upset. It's been a long few months for everyone. Your father and I have decided to be generous. We're going to give you $5,000 from the estate. It's more than you deserve considering how you stayed away at the end." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a check, already signed. "Take it," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Go back to your life and just forget all this bitterness. It's what's best for the family." I looked down at the check, then back at the woman who had lied to a dying man's face. She actually thought my relationship with Grandpa had a price tag. She thought $5,000 could buy my silence about the recording in my pocket. I didn't take the check. I just walked back into the living room and took the seat next to the lawyer's briefcase. The lawyer cleared his throat to begin, but I stood up before he could speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Before we read any documents," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "Grandpa had something he wanted everyone to hear. He wanted to make sure there was no confusion about his final wishes." I pulled the digital recorder from my pocket and placed it in the center of the coffee table. My mother's eyes darted to my father, her brow furrowed in confusion. I pressed play. Grandpa's thin, raspy voice filled the room. The silence that followed was absolute. When he got to the part about my parents telling him I was in Europe spending his money, my aunt let out a sharp, audible gasp. But the room turned ice cold when Grandpa spoke the date and time, specifically mentioning the evening my mother had brought in a new stack of papers for him to sign while he was drifting in and out of consciousness. I watched the color drain from my mother's face. The smug, polished mask she'd worn all morning shattered, leaving her looking small and gray. My father stared at the floor, his jaw tight, as Grandpa's voice finished with a final, heartbreaking, "I love you, Sarah." The betrayal was no longer a private secret, it was vibrating in the air between us, and for the first time in months, my parents had nowhere to hide. My father lunged for the recorder, his hand outstretched like a claw, but Mr. Henderson was faster. He stepped between us, his face like stone. "Don't make this a criminal matter right here in your living room, Bill," the lawyer warned. My father collapsed back into his chair, breathing hard, the deed to the house trembling in his grip. I didn't reach for that deed. Instead, I pulled the damp, earth-stained envelope from my bag and laid it on the table. "This is the will Grandpa hid," I told the room. "He didn't leave the house to you. He left the entire estate to the hospice center that cared for Grandma." I looked at my parents, who were staring at the paper as if it were a death warrant. "He left me a small trust for my education, and he left you nothing but the furniture you're sitting on." My mother looked up, her eyes bright with a sudden, venomous hatred. "You've ruined us," she hissed, her voice low so the rest of the family couldn't hear. "You threw away your own inheritance just to spite us. You're as stubborn and selfish as he was." I looked at her and felt nothing but pity. "I didn't do this for the money, Mom. I would have lived in a tent for the rest of my life just to have spent one more hour with him. You stole the only thing that mattered, and you did it for a house you don't even own anymore." I walked out the front door, leaving them in the silence of a home that was no longer theirs. The silence in the living room didn't last long. It was quickly replaced by the low, angry murmurs of my aunts and uncles. They looked at my parents not with sympathy, but with a visceral disgust. They realized they had been used as a chorus for a smear campaign, nodding along to lies while a dying man was isolated and manipulated. One by one, they stood up and walked out, refusing to even look at my mother as she reached out to them. By the time the sun began to set, the house was empty of everyone but my parents and the lawyer, who served them with the formal notice to vacate. A few days later, I met Elena at a small park near the hospital. She looked different without the scrubs, softer, but with the same knowing eyes. She told me that after I'd been forced out that final day, she had stayed with Grandpa until the very end. "I wanted you to have that note," she whispered, her voice steady. "I wrote down what I heard your mother saying to him when she thought no one was listening. But more importantly, I wanted you to know what happened when it was just him and me." She reached across the bench and squeezed my hand. The monitors were failing, and he was drifting. He wasn't in pain anymore. He leaned toward me, and he didn't ask for his lawyer or his bank books. He just whispered your name, Sarah. He whispered it like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to this world. The bridge between me and my parents was a blackened, smoking ruin. I didn't know if I could ever forgive them, but as I sat in that park, I realized I didn't need their permission to be whole again. I had the truth, and I had his love. That was an inheritance they could never touch. A few months later, the garden didn't look like a battlefield anymore. The hospice center had transformed the estate into a community sanctuary, and the stone with the carved robin was now surrounded by a sea of vibrant bluebells and marigolds. I sat on a new wooden bench, the morning sun warming my face, watching a young couple walk their dog where my parents once plotted their scheme. The cost of the truth had been high. I no longer had a relationship with my parents. Our last contact was a cold, formal letter from their bankruptcy attorney. But the heavy, suffocating weight that had lived in my chest since that first hospital visit was finally gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable peace. I pulled the small digital recorder from my pocket one last time. I didn't need to press play anymore. I had every word of his raspy whisper etched into my heart. My parents had controlled the doors, the phone calls, and the paperwork, but they couldn't control the spirit of the man inside the room. They had stolen his final days, but I had kept his soul. As I stood to leave, I looked at the garden and realized that love doesn't need a gatekeeper. It finds a way through the dirt, through the lies, and through the silence. The truth isn't just about exposing the darkness, it's about making sure the light has a place to land. When the doors close and the world isn't looking, character is all we have left. Do you think some betrayals are too deep to ever truly forgive, or is there always a path back?